So we've seen two positions, both incompatibilist, one that places greater value on human freedom and autonomy, one that places greater value on divine sovereignty and providence. The question is whether there's an intermediate position, a position compatibilist in nature, so it says we will embrace the kind of understanding of freedom that open theists embrace, and we'll also embrace the kind of full sovereignty, providential control that theological determinists embrace. That's the million-dollar question regarding the freedom-foreknowledge problem. In the middle, the standard view is Molinism. Molinism is the view that you can have both. Before we look at the details of Molinism, though, let's look at how Molinism relates to the argument that we've been looking at, the argument for theological determinism. Both open theism and theological determinism tell you something specific about that argument. The open theist looks at the argument and says it has a false premise, the premise about God's always having believed what the future is going to look like. The theological determinist, if not a hard determinist, looks at the argument and says it has a false premise. It has a premise that endorses the principle of alternative possibilities, and that principle is false. So, nice argument, false premise. Both people say that. The open theist says, nice argument, false premise. The theological determinist says, nice argument, false premise, unless the theological determinist is a hard determinist. And then the theological determinist of that sort says, nice argument, sound argument. So a Molinist walks into the room. The Molinist looks at the argument and says, what? What does the Molinist say? The Molinist holds a middle position, so endorses the kind of view of autonomy and human freedom that the open theist holds, and also holds the view of sovereignty and providence that the theological determinist holds. So when the open theist walked into the room, open theist said, nice argument, false premise. Theological determinist of the non-hard variety walks into the room, says, nice argument, false premise. What does the Molinist say? Molinist walks into the room and says, I'm with you guys. I'm on both of your sides. Now that's possible. Maybe both premises are false. Maybe the open theist premise is false and the one targeted by the theological determinists in question is false. But the Molinist does not reject the premise that the open theist rejects. So the Molinist looks at the argument in much the same way that the theological determinist does. Yep, God always has believed that you're going to get up at 9 a.m. tomorrow, if in fact you're going to get up at 9 a.m. So what's left? What does the Molinist say about this argument? Well, the Molinist does not actually say anything about the argument. Not immediately, not directly. In this way, Molinism takes a different stance with respect to the freedom-foreknowledge problem than either open theism or theological determinism. Those two positions confront the argument head-on. Molinism tries to do an end run around the argument. Maybe we'll come back to the claims of the argument the Molinist espouses. Maybe we'll come back and see what we think about the argument when we're done with our discussion, but we're just not going to talk about that argument. Now, that's a cause for concern, but maybe there's nothing wrong with doing that. Let me try to explain briefly why the Molinists might be on acceptable ground in making such a choice to ignore the argument. Think of it this way. Go back to the scope fallacy discussion that we had about wide and narrow scope readings of necessity claims. So the narrow scope reading, which would have been useful for Augustine, is if God always believed that you're going to do X, then you have to do X. The narrow scope reading gets you the loss of freedom that Augustine was worried about, but there's no particular reason to endorse it without further argument. The wide scope reading is it's a necessary truth that if God foreknew or forebelieved that you're going to do X, then you're going to do X. But that wide scope reading doesn't get you any loss of freedom. So stand at that point in the discussion and now compare foreknowledge and forebelief on the one hand with something more threatening to human freedom. So God not only believes in advance what you're going to do, sometimes God ordains things about the future. Sometimes God decrees things about the future. So think about the idea of decreeing or ordaining that something will happen in the future. Suppose Augustine had put the argument that way. The difference, of course, is that there is no theological presumption that everything that happens is ordained by God or decreed by God. There are arguments to try to establish that, to force a theist to say such a thing, because then the problem of evil becomes really severe. But suppose you're able to avoid that issue. So you don't think God decrees or ordains everything. But suppose you did think that. Let's go back to the scope fallacy context when we were talking about wide and narrow scope with respect to Augustine's claim that if God foreknows what you're going to do, then you have loss of freedom. You do what you do of necessity, and so autonomy flies out the window. Let's take a look at that and change from foreknowledge to divine decrees and divine ordinances. So suppose God ordains that you get up at 9 a.m. tomorrow. Suppose God decrees that you get up at 9 a.m. tomorrow. Once again, you can run the two claims with wide and narrow scope, just as you did with foreknowledge. What makes discussions of decrees and ordaining more threatening here is that you're thinking in terms of orders of explanation. You're thinking about which direction explains which. So in the case of foreknowledge, you know that the logical implication between foreknowledge and the truth of what God believes in advance runs both ways. If God believes that you're going to get up at 9 a.m. tomorrow, you'll get up at 9 a.m. tomorrow. And on standard theological assumptions, if you're going to get up at 9 a.m. tomorrow, then God has always believed that you're going to get up at 9 a.m. tomorrow. But the logical relationships, even though they go both ways, explanation relationships only go one way. Does God's belief in advance explain you're getting up tomorrow? That would generate loss of freedom. Or does your getting up tomorrow explain God's belief in the past? That would not involve loss of freedom, though it may generate perplexities of other sorts, like the idea of backward causation. But in any case, the question is about orders of explanation, direction of explanation. With respect to ordaining and decreeing, if God decrees or ordains that you're going to do such and such, that doesn't really leave a lot of room to say the direction of explanation runs from the future to the past. That's not a likely story for any theologian to be willing to embrace. It looks like once you talk about ordaining and decreeing, the direction of explanation is obvious. If God decrees that P and P happens, what's the story here? Is God's decree explained by what happens in the future, or is what happens in the future explained by God's decree? The answer is it's explained by God's decree. As soon as we notice the difference between logical facts and explanatory relationships, we open up the possibility that one can look at the argument for theological determinism and be unmoved by it because one insists stories about explanation and stories about logical implication aren't the same thing, they come apart. And I think behind Molinism is this idea. What we are interested in are explanatory relationships, not merely logical relationships, because the logical relationships, whatever they are, leave open the explanatory question. If A and B mutually imply each other logically, that doesn't tell us which one explains the other. So Molinists spend more time describing their view than saying exactly how this connects up with the argument for theological determinism. And that's a cause for complaint. You can find such a complaint in some of the work of John Martin Fisher, for example. And it would be nice at the end of the day, after they explain what their position is, if they come back to the argument and say, so exactly what's your view of this argument and how does your position give a response to this argument? There is less of that than there is explicit discussion of the Molinist view, because the Molinist view itself raises all sorts of important theological and philosophical problems. That's been the focus of discussion on the view.